Hey everybody, my name is Kavanagh. I'm co-director of the Climate Majority Project with Rupert Reed and co-founder of Life Itself. We're coming to you from the Life Itself Practice Hub in Bergerac, France. And here with us today is Stephen Markley, author of the climate epic that the climate world is buzzing about. Thank you for joining us, Stephen.
Thank you for having me.
So I would call the Deluge a kind of realistic envisioning of how climate reality will unfold, complete with the types of characters that we might imagine get thrust to prominence. Nobody knows what they're like, and the types of cultural and structural conflicts that are almost bound to play out, but in kind of living color. Is that?
Yeah, that's a very well put. Yeah.
And it's of great interest to a lot of people who feel like they're kind of reading the future that they always imagine. And I suppose that is part of your what you're trying to achieve in writing it.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, sort of the project was to extrapolate what's going to happen as the climate crisis continues to metastasize, as all these trends gain steam, and imagine what the future will look like. And obviously that can be a very frightening future, but I think the book also takes the idea of, well, what do we do to resist this? What do we do to avoid the worst consequences of the crisis? And it sort of projects these characters into that future, all of them in their own way fighting for a better world.
Yeah, so some people will have come to us by reading the book, and so I guess we don't want to spoil it too much.
Right.
But suffice to say, so it's of great interest to CMP and Life Itself, because CMP is Climate Majority Project is really looking to create almost something a lot like one of the movements that's envisioned in your book, A Fierce Blue Fire.
Right.
Really going mainstream, that you have to have a movement that appeals to not just the usual suspects, but other groups. And then Life Itself is really looking forward to the next culture that's a bit like envisioning a change in civilization, as my co-founder in the Climate Majority Project, Rupert Reed, has said, the civilization is finished. Imagining this civilization finishing is really an important part of that journey for people in I think both organizations.
Yeah.
And so I suppose that's also really part of what you allow a lot of people to do, is really experience in living color what it might be like to have their civilization finish.
Yeah, well, I think the project of the book is to not just give people an idea of what we're going to live through and what we're facing, but also some of the avenues that might help us get out of it. Mm-hmm. To give them sort of, a character-driven, a thrilling sort of read that just happens to inform you quite well about, the pathways we might take to avoid, again, the worst consequences of what's coming.
Mm-mm-mm. So, I mean, it's a great segue to the next question. So there's this word Thrutopian that Rupert's popularized, right? Yeah. This kind of, it's imagining the best possible way through to transition. Right. We're obviously in a downward spiral. It's not a utopia. It's not going to be perfect. There's going to be lots of pain, but what's the best possible way into an ecological society? So we actually think that your book is really a great example of Thrutopian fiction. Some people might disagree with that, so I was wondering, would you agree that it is, and if so, if you could just explain a little bit more about the artistic choices that...
I think the word Thrutopian, like for me when I heard it, I was like, oh, finally, like something that sort of like gets at the crux of what the project is. I mean, something that has not irritated me, but let's say like low-level irked me, is to hear the book described as a dystopia or as an piece of apocalyptic fiction, which it's clearly not. Like, it's as realist as it comes. And the way I know that is because everything that happens in it keeps coming true. And so, what I think is hard for people to grasp is that it's like, no, this is, not every event in the book is going to play out the way it does, obviously. But on the whole, that's exactly the kind of world we're setting up for ourselves. It's sort of already the world we're living in right now. As we're having this conversation, there's these horrible floods in Eastern Europe. There were these fires in Portugal. It's just like we are inundated now with the crisis, with news of it 24/7 pretty much. And so we have to first face that fact that like this is going to be something we're all coping with for the rest of our lifetimes, for as far as the eye can see. And at the same time, the book doesn't throw up its hands about that fact. It's very intent on sort of demonstrating the kind of thinking and the kind of passion and the kind of relentlessness that so many of these scientists and activist characters carry with them. And this conviction that like out of this crisis can be born an opportunity to create that more just, equitable, and prosperous world.
Yeah, that comes through in a lot of the characters. And it's also, of course, there's lots of villains, but that wouldn't be a real story without those people. In particular, I think it's of interest to us and really fits into the mission of the Climate Majority Project, because one of the things that we see as really missing from the climate movement is this feeling on behalf of most extremely climate concerned people, or just climate concerned people, that there's something viable to be part of.
Yeah.
And that's not sitting right in front of us. It's not obvious that there is, but it seems kind of logically or emotionally obvious that it has to develop. And I feel like, in a way, you really help to... There's this kind of almost double meaning in the title of the Deluge, right?
Yeah.
That it is almost inevitable that this welling up of need, of necessity, results in something.
Yes.
Right?
I would say, first off, that one of the struggles that the climate movement has had, and this is, my observation as an outsider, right? So I don't want to like pretend like I've been like a deep connected part of this thing for decades, because I've been observing it in order to write about it, right? But in order to be successful, we cannot build a clubhouse. We have to build a movement, and those are really important distinctions. Especially in sort of activist left-wing circles, it's really easy to get self-referential, to get insular, and to be arguing about like the most esoteric points rather than facing this overwhelming task at hand, right? So this movement cannot just attract, like as you put it, sort of standard characters. Like it has to bring in people who normally wouldn't be a part of something like this. It has to be attractive to those segments of society, because it's only with that broad-based, popular, working class, of the majority movement that we're going to be successful, right? Excuse me. So the second point I'll make to that is, I do feel like just given the nature of like modernity, we are all in our little like isolated bubbles. We're all in our heads a lot. We're all on our screens a lot, and we don't look around and see the other people that we could potentially join arms with, right? And to me, when I've had the good fortune, because of the book, of going around to a lot of different spaces, from people who don't know anything about climate in bookstores in Indiana and Ohio, to places like this where everybody's intense about it, right? And what I do think, though, that binds all of these different hubs I've been to, all these different sort of locations, is you get the sense of this rising army. That is just, it's a little fragmented right now, but I can really feel it. I can feel people's passion in a way I couldn't maybe 10 years ago, 5 years ago. And I think it's being spurred also by really helpful policies that are taking place, especially in the U.S. And I do feel like as this decade progresses, and as, this decade being such a crucial moment in the climate crisis, we're going to see that intensity rise. And it's just a matter of channeling it in the right directions, and sort of figuring out the right wars to wage, and all the rest of that.
Yeah, I guess I almost want to say it's utopian in that I feel like a lot of the time, this kind of idea that hope springs eternal is absent, right? There's a lot of discussion of we can't talk about 1.5 being gone because people are going to get demoralized. And I think one thing that comes across in the book is that hope does spring eternal in the hearts of men. There's always resistance going on, that there is this kind of constant will to survive, and things don't go swimmingly. It isn't kind of the breakthrough of some grand strategic genius or whatever otherworldly rhetorical powers. It's this kind of popular will.
Right. Well, and I think this isn't a spoiler of the book, but in the novel, I think we do blow past 1.5. I think as the book ends, they're talking about we might be able to stop it at 2.7. Right. So and that's all only to say that like every 1/10 of a degree, every 100th of a 1/10 of a degree matters in this. It's every 1/10 of a degree that we can shave off is lives saved. Millions of lives saved. Endless suffering avoided, and so it's worth the fight no matter what, just to like keep the temperature as low as we possibly can manage.
Okay, so question B. I find it, sort of very optimistic as a kind of baseline almost, because a lot of people who look into climate facts who experience the picture that you paint as real. Which I think people who read climate science kind of recognize what they've been reading in august journals on the pages of fiction. But a lot of people who were able to read that way or informed that way just think, God, it's going we're headed for, it's sort of oblivion, or at least we're likely, and it's sort of almost like a baseline in a way that it's actually quite optimistic as a baseline. Well, at the end of the day, finally, there's the will to live, the will to survival has to kind of prevail and somehow has to show up. Now, would you agree with that? And
yeah, I think absolutely. I guess like when I hear people say like, "Oh, it's too late."
Yeah.
Well, it's too late for what? At the end of the day, this is going to give one way or another. Either we are going to confront this crisis, or it's going to force us to confront it, if that makes sense.
Right.
Because eventually the crisis will interact with our market capitalist system in a way that system can no longer bear the sort of the insanity it's producing. So one way or the other, and that's sort of like the outcome of the book, not to give too many spoilers, but one way or the other, we're going to deal with this. It's a matter of if we're proactive about it now, or if we wait for the shit to really hit the fan, and then we have to, improvise everything.
Right. Okay. And so the follow-up question there is, if you were to imagine a more utopian Thrutopia, or if you went back and rewrote it, or are there some possibilities that you threw out because you wanted to write something that was really real and hopeful, but are not impossible, not impossibilities, but possibilities where we might be able to improve on that kind of.
Well, I'll say this, like, writing the book, I wanted to not only stick absolutely as close to the scientific reality and what scientists tell us is going to happen. I also wanted to stick to our political reality and our economic reality, and not jump to some kind of hunky-dory future that you sort of yada 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 away the explanation for how we got there. Like, I didn't want to do that at all. I wanted a serious thinking through of every mechanism, every policy that would produce the slightly better pathway that the book, is sort of pushing people down, right? And that's not to say that like I in any way want to denigrate utopian thinking. Like, I think it's always good we're trying to imagine a better world, but it's a realist novel. Again, like, that's what I keep coming back to. Like, this is about reality and how we cope with it. And to me, that is like, here are the really shitty political systems we have to work with, and none of them are good enough to deal with this crisis. So how do we galvanize action to move all these shitty political systems at once in the direction we need to go.
Mm-hmm. Well, so here's a kind of a question. So, missing one character that I kind of saw potentially missing from the book is somebody like Andrew Forrest, the mining magnate, Australian mining magnate, who recently came out from the Bow Forum and said business is the problem, and then announced plans to kind of turn his entire fleet to hydrogen. Now, not to say he's had an easy time. I don't know if you've been following his story.
No, I have not.
So he's had to fire 3 CFOs. He's kind of a CEO. We want to do this, and he would come back from vacation, have his CFO changing everything, and then have to fire them 3 times. But he's actually gone through three CFOs and is still kind of sticking to it. You know, is there a possibility that, you know, maybe by reading books like this, right, that if we do a better job of painting a picture of the reality that is right now seems inevitable, that some of the people who in fact have interest in change that haven't seen it yet might realize that interest sooner, so that there could be some new characters added to the book by...
Well, let me say a couple of things. First of all, Liam, if you want to rewrite my 1,000-page book with a new character, by all means, like, you can have at it. The second point I'll make is that I think for me, in like choosing the characters or who we were going to follow in the novel, I just didn't want anybody who started out in an elite strata of society. Like, I wanted everybody who I was following to be from like essentially a middle class or lower class background. Just because like I wanted the book to feel like it was populated by normal people. And I think popular culture spends a lot of time imagining societal elites, you know, and like Succession, a show I loved, but like that is a very typical kind of narrative we're given, is we want to know about the lives of presidents and businessmen and kings and emperors, right? Like that's what we're sort of tossed. And to me, what the Deluge is about the momentum of people who don't have those resources, but who have to forge enormous change nevertheless, right?
That's interesting. Because, I mean, I think of people like, say, software engineers at Google. So, interestingly enough, it's like there's an organization we work with called Climate Voice, right? It's almost like we need something that's a bit like a new labor union. So if you look at something that's actually achieved something like what we need to achieve in terms of shifting millions, billions, right? There was a point at which people was trying, basically fairly stupid shit, like just talking to the capitalists, really. Trying to convince them to change the laws.
Well, this is the other thing I was going to say. In order to write that character, I'd have to imagine a conscience into a capitalist, like a business person. So,
right.
It's like a real leap of imagination.
Yeah, I mean, there's the thing is, everybody in this particular case, right? Like, everybody's deepest interest is in some type of change, right? There's this weird, thing that is missing, right? Where at the final moment, people might realize, actually, it's
and just to because your point about Andrew Forrest, was it?
Yeah.
I'm going to look into this guy as soon as we're done here. But I do think that like the business case right now is obviously we shouldn't be burning fossil fuels to like cook the planet to extinction. Like, just if you're a greedy capitalist, it makes more sense to not do that. Right? So it's almost like we're caught in this incredibly bizarre paradigm where the people who are going, like, really stand to lose the most monetarily are forging ahead nevertheless. And so there's this element of like just absurdity to it, of just absolute insanity to even the project that's being undertaken to not turn the world around, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which I think the reader ends up grappling with in a really, forceful way, and it was very powerful, I think, for everybody that I've spoken to who's read it. So I mean, and I think that is another work of Thrutopia or Cli-Fi, right? I think this is a whole genre, right? And you probably yourself expect dozens, hundreds of books on this subject.
I actually read almost no Cli-Fi. I did research and did not engage with what was then a more burgeoning genre. Just because, to me, it was like I don't want to know what other people are doing. I want like this thing in my head to come out. It's sort of an avoidance that I've kept up in some ways.
It probably makes a lot of sense, right? Like in the future, what you kind of want is not, as soon as people start reading each other, then there tends to be this collapse if you write from obscurity in a way.
Just keeping your brain fresh for what, like the project I was undertaking, I had not seen in any novel yet, or even like anything close to an attempt, because the book is not just about climate, it's about the American political system. It's about our economy and the way it functions. It's about sort of the forces within society that like make it difficult to forge a big movement. It's about those sort of like the arguments we all have online, right? It's about all that stuff and
right.
more. It's about technology. It's about surveillance capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. And I just wanted to avoid the taint of anything else. I really wanted to be like, no, this is like my vision of the future, and I'm going to selfishly sit here and make it, including moving the capital to Cleveland, Ohio.
Yeah. Isn't that, and that's kind of the role of an artist in a lot of ways, I think, right? To have a singular vision that allows other people to kind of engage with another world, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think in speaking earlier of like sort of the rising army of people who are passionate about saving the planet from the climate crisis, right? We all have our role to play. And for me, in this subject I was enormously passionate about as a young person, it was like, okay, what can I do? And it's like, I'm a writer. I want to be a writer, and I want to imagine how to bring this epic problem to narrative and to make people feel emotionally what the stakes of the crisis actually are.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so let's go a little bit deeper into this question of how can we improve, I suppose, on the outcomes in the book. One thing that has really came across in the book, again, no spoilers, is that the polarization of America does not go away. It gets even stronger. I mean, it's really clear from your book that it's at the center of the inability of one of the world's most powerful countries, probably still the most powerful country, to take a leadership role on that issue. And so the question would be, is there a way past that? Can we imagine a way past that? And particularly, I, of course, asked that because the Climate Majority Project is really engaged in that. That is one of the things that we think is that the climate movement, as you say, there's this rising army of people who know something needs to be done.
Yeah.
And the current kind of identity politics, moral purity-driven conversation that dominates progressive movements is not really getting it done. There's a reason why the climate movement, a climate movement which talks in the kind of seriousness that the book lays out, who takes the facts seriously, does not really travel outside the progressive activist bubble. It's not. So is there a way of getting outside of that?
Yeah, let me say several hundred things in response to that. First of all, again, the climate movement has to include people with whom we disagree. If it does not include people with whom we disagree, it is not a movement, it is a clubhouse, right? And having clubhouses are absolutely fine, but they're not going to move our industrial civilization to net zero carbon as quickly as we need it to, right? So we have an enormous amount of problems with the world. Our entire system is built on vast historical injustices that, as soon as you look at them, are so gruesome and horrifying, it's hard to really fathom and wrap your head around. However, that does not change the moment we're in and the crisis we're in, right? We need to be at roughly net zero carbon in 25, 30 years. And that is such a huge task to accomplish, right? So that's the first part. Second, when we talk about some of the issues you were referring to, often it's put in this way that we have to sit everybody down and yell at them strenuously enough until they agree with the correct way to use language, the correct way to think about things, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's like taking those problems from the opposite direction. The way to build a mass movement is to have the same project in front of all of us, right? And so I'll just use the American example of what the Inflation Reduction Act tried to do in dispersing money around the country through for climate-related projects, for decarbonization projects, right? So it was looking at energy communities, environmental justice communities, places that had borne the brunt of fossil fuel development, and saying, let's put some of this money into those communities. What does that do, right? So not only does it build the political support for action on climate change, but it also puts the, what's it called, kitchen table issues. The mother of all pocketbook issues is the climate crisis, right? And so when you sort of look at the way the IRA dispersed money, it is trying to draw into the fight against climate change a vast array of people from different backgrounds, from different geographic locations, and put this issue in front of them so that it is sort of one's pocketbook relies upon action on climate change. And I think this is sort of like the wedge that can get in the way of our endless sort of fights about everything, every possible issue under the sun.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one way also, I guess I would
please add to that.
Yeah, we may just want to kind of take it upon ourselves to really just have out some of these arguments. Like, for example, all of the wealth of the Western world is from robbing the global South.
Totally.
Which,
right.
Yeah, I mean, the colonialism was a thing, the U.S. empire was a thing,
right.
Extermination of loads of people, and like 1 million people in a day in the Jakarta method in Indonesia. If people have heard of that, is a thing done with CIA knowledge. Lots of bad things have happened. However, the whole rest of the world thinks technology is the source of wealth, and if you look at historical data, it turns out pretty much all economic historians think that as well, right? You have this kind of weird spectacle of Korea, where there's never been a Korean empire. It's this really rich country, and the whole global, many people in the global South want to follow that kind of example, as it's sort of at odds with a lot of the narrative that's coming out of the progressive world, where it's sort of, it is this, it can be a club. It sounds like there's a certain group of people who think and talk a certain way and who are identified with climate action or
Sure.
serious kind of radical, you could say, climate action. I would just call it commensurate.
Okay.
Commensurate to the situation at hand, is kind of identified with that progressive culture. But the reality is that there's a lot of stuff in it which is just most of the population doesn't agree with, will never agree with.
Yeah.
Right? And if we don't pull climate apart from that culture, such that it starts, there are not visible counterexamples to the idea that I'm really serious about climate action. I think the whole economy needs to be turned upside down to do it, and I disagree with the standard left-wing talking points. If we don't have those counterexamples, then we can't in many ways have an intelligent public conversation, because we'll always have this ability to equate seriousness about climate with kind of left-wingness.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think it's always a hazard that in order to get people to subscribe to your program, they have to agree with everything else that you want, like every other piece of ideology you have. That is, and often that is that is a way of sort of ignoring the enormity of the problem, right? Like when you think of all the horrors in human history across all of time, it's hard to imagine that could be peanuts compared to what will happen if we don't move on this, right? Like the outside scenarios of if things get really out of hand, if the planet really starts to heat up, and some of these feedback loops start kicking in, and the methane hydrates start to melt, and the tundra, the permafrost starts to melt, like it's going to look like so unbelievably horrible that novelists will not be able to describe it properly, right? And so just like sort of that staggering monster, that genie in the bottle that we're toying with right now, perhaps getting ready to let loose, that has to be our overriding sort of notion of what we're trying to forestall. Mm-hmm. And I sometimes like think like, oh my God, like if people 200 years from now look back and they see the kind of arguments we were having while this thing was underway, while it was about to happen, when we had this slim moment of time to do something about it, like we're gonna look like such fucking idiots.
Yeah. I mean, so getting to, I guess, short-term reasons for hope, things people can do. What do you think about adaptation, sort of local level adaptation? One of the things that's really struck us when we were reading the book is the organization we mentioned, the Fierce Blue Fire. Part of the way that sort of spread itself was community service in a way, getting involved in communities. Now, if we go all the way and being monumentally stupid, there's no adaptation to that.
Right.
Even if for the future that kind of plays out in your book, or even a better version of that, there's plenty of adaptation to do.
Yeah.
And we know that people don't know their neighbors in big parts of the United States. The UK is similar.
Yeah.
Is it an opportunity to really get the villages and cities of the US, the UK, looking at what's coming down the pipe and start adapting? Is that, and should the climate movement as a whole be really getting behind that idea as a rallying cry? Like, we actually need to start accept that 1.5 is dead, and people everywhere, we can actually get people who are not elites, who don't feel that they're going to show up and make any meaningful speeches at Davos or a COP meeting, to get into climate action. And wouldn't that make it more real in a lot of ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly right. There's a way that, like, you know, any way you can get people to be together in a room with each other instead of like yelling at each other via screens is a good thing. Certainly, the resiliency of our communities is going to become incredibly important as time goes on. That's going to, I think, become a lived experience for a lot of people, if it's not already. You know, I forget, there's a statistic floating out there that I can't remember, but how many people have lived through a weather disaster in the United States in the last, like, 4 years? That was staggering. Mm-hmm. And it just sort of, like, made my eyes pop even. The other thing I'll add is that I think there are ways to be active in doing something about the climate crisis that do not involve activism. And I sometimes think that, like, our focus on activism makes people think the only way I can care about this is if I'm marching in the streets shouting through a bullhorn. That's not everybody's jam, though, and it's certainly not my jam. And, you know, one of the things I've been sort of jokingly telling young people who ask me, though not really joking, when I talk at, like, colleges or whatever, is, you know, instead of getting this degree, why not become a union electrician? Mm-hmm. And that just goes to the fact that, like, you know, you become a union electrician, you're making really good money really quickly, you're working on the front lines of decarbonization. There's one stat that Bill McKibben always uses, that the U.S. is going to need 1 million more electricians in the next decade to, you know, do all the wiring of all the electrification that we're going to have to do. And furthermore, you're in a union, you're joining a community, you're forging political power. And so looking at just other angles for how to be a part of this movement, I think, is vital. And certainly anybody looking to go into fields of you know, engineering, figuring out what we're going to do about our coastlines, figuring out what we're going to do about, you know, managing all the enormous changes that are going to happen geophysically, you know, to our countries, to our homes. All of this matters. So there's just a number of ways of getting involved in this issue. that maybe don't involve dealing with people who are going to yell at you all the time for, saying something wrong over.
Yeah. Well,
I'm very conscious about not getting canceled on this video right now, so I didn't even want to come up with an example.
Right, don't worry. We'll edit it out. We can leave it to be canceled. I think the last thing we could actually ask about is so basically, I think for a lot of people reading about it, we always say at CMP that there's kind of 4 dimensions of mobilization.
Yeah.
You need to know what reality is.
Yeah.
That there is an issue, first of all, which congratulations.
Yeah.
You've helped lay it out, and for people to actually feel it, have something to do. Which we've spoken about that a bit. This sense of being part of something larger, which we talked about at the beginning, and then finally, when things don't add up, this sense of being part of something larger, this like collective awareness or inner support.
Yeah.
So you could say like inner work, and part of there's 2 things. Is this a good kind of book club book? Because I find that it's probably disturbing to quite a lot of people. Now I work in climate change, so I've thought about these things before and speak to other people, but it might be a really good thing for people to read together in a book club. The other thing, of course, is just, do you notice a kind of carrier bag theory of fiction? So this is like Ursula Le Guin has this kind of comment that there's not a lot of fiction about farms, right? There are a lot of fiction about hunts, right? And this kind of like quiet work of grappling with things is not something that really makes it
not sexy.
Yeah. So is there an element of, like, we noted, when there's community service and people bonding, that doesn't make for page turning,
right?
But do you find that hard to write about, and is a way that people could do some of that maybe by taking in some good climate fiction together and processing it emotionally?
Yeah. No, I mean, I always say, like, the number one thing any individual can do to forestall and to work on the climate crisis is buy copies of Stephen Markley's The Deluge for everyone they know. That is overwhelmingly what we need to get done, right? But no, I actually, like, I have appeared at several, via Zoom on several book clubs, right, of people who have, like, read it with friends and, like, gotten together. And I love doing that because it's like, you get the sense of everybody, like, dealing deeply and intellectually with this topic, but also, like, drinking wine and having a good time and, joking about this really dark thing that, like, you need to, like, release a little, tension from yourself. And I think it's sort of a great way of, like, getting inside. Now, people are obviously frightened by the length, but to your other point, it's like once you start the book, you're pretty much flipping pages pretty quickly.
Yeah.
It does read propulsively, right? And that was sort of my theory.
It'll annihilate your weekend.
Yeah, exactly. And that was sort of my theory of the case always with it, was like, I want people to feel in their heart what the stakes of this are. I want them to feel emotionally what I feel, but also I just want to tell a great story. Mm-hmm. Like, I want them to love these characters and to care what happens to them so that they cannot stop flipping pages. And I think for me, that is always the best compliment when people tell me, like, oh, I was so scared to start it and then I finished it in a week. Is that sense that, like, it is a freight train and you're strapped to it and you're just like, good, I'm glad I'm on this freight train.
Yeah. I needed to see that ride. Yeah. Great.
Yeah.
I think, so one other question. Throughout the Deluge, there is a feeling of technological dystopia as well. So I wonder if you've noticed, like I have in recent years, people realizing, like, quite sharply suddenly, that technological advance is not necessarily a good thing. I remember when the Unabomber, I'm actually now old enough to to remember the Unabomber and be from the same city as the Unabomber. And when it first happened, it was a bit like kind of a madman in a way. And he was mad, he bombed people, but the whole supposition of, the computers are coming for us. And people were a bit like, yeah, but he kind of has a point. Now, actually, like, stories about the Unabomber ends up being like sort of positive, which is crazy, right? Like there was, I think, an HBO special where essentially it ended up being sympathetic. Do you see that deepening? And is that sort of something that we can build on, because the faith in modernity and progress, this kind of idea, things are just getting better, which is maybe at the core of climate change. It just can't be true that we're going to fuck things up that badly because, we're enlightened, we're post-enlightenment Europe. Do you think is that fracturing? And do you see opportunities there?
Well, to answer your question without directly endorsing the Unabomber, I'll avoid that. I do think that the book has a critique of what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, right? And so we were all sold this real bullshit bill of goods by sort of the tech scions of Silicon Valley, that we're all going to be connected, we're all going to know each other intimately, and it's going to be this wonderful sort of utopian project. And it turns out that's all just absolute horseshit. And what it actually is these companies mining our data to make us scared, anxious, angry, depressed, afraid, and furious at each other. And now you see the effects of that everywhere. You see it in our politics. You see it with teenagers, and just the teenage suicide rate over the last basically since the advent of the smartphone became ubiquitous. I mean, it's just shocking. And these people have like no conscience about it whatsoever, right? Mm-hmm. But it's not just social media. It's Google. It's every like free thing we use that is all about surveilling us, to sell us stuff, to influence our opinions, et cetera, right? And so this is an enormous problem because, I have sometimes wondered if we can even have social movements right now that will function and work correctly when all of the things we consume basically make us insane. And so I think we have to stop viewing, all of these platforms as the public square where free speech happens, and we have to view them as polluting industries that are poisoning us. And they must be regulated, taken on, sued, and all the rest accordingly. Now, I'll follow that up with, I also don't want to sound, entirely technophobic, right? Like, I do think there's a strain in, potentially within the environmental community about, like, don't build anything anywhere ever, right? And in order to get ourselves out of this, we are going to end up, expanding our footprint on the planet in order to put up the necessary solar, wind, geothermal energy. And that's going to be another project, is figuring out how to shrink our footprint and make sure that the energy we're using is for useful purposes and not mining fucking cryptocurrency, right? And so really, like any other political problem, it's a matter of priorities, it's a matter of our choices. But to your statement of progress, it's like, have we ever, sort of when I think about making progress, I'm so interested in all these people trying to figure out how to build a circular economy, how to build a way of living that doesn't just like extract mindlessly, but regenerates and sort of gives humanity the chance to work with the Earth systems rather than against them. And I think there's a lot of interesting thinking in that direction. And over the years, I hope to like explore it more, so I'm a little more versed on it. But I think that is an idea of progress we should hold up. And that this idea of like, endless tech bubbles and sort of exploitative, extractive systems of data mining are like pretty much a dead end.
Yeah, I think what I hear though is like, in order to make that kind of progress, it's about looking at something like the Deluge and waking up from this dream of progress, saying, "Oh, wait, actually, yeah, we haven't been progressing for a while now, and there's something deeply wrong here." And when we actually realize that might be the point where we progress again.
Yeah, maybe so. And yet, I never want to I was reading Thomas Piketty this summer. I'm sorry if I just butchered that guy's name. And one of his books is called The Social History of Equality, right? And he talks about how like humanity has been on a pretty much uninterrupted march towards more equity, more justice, more prosperity, until like the 1970s, when it takes this dip again. Basically, when the neoliberal era comes along, right? And again, it's something humans have dealt with across centuries. Is the concentration of wealth leading to the concentration of political power, leading to sort of like a system of injustice that can't sustain itself and that will eventually explode unless measures are taken.
Yeah. Thank you, Stephen, for joining us for the conversation and exploring all these topics. I think a lot of people are going to find it a useful read, a rewarding read for thinking about a new civilization and the climate crisis.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This has honestly been awesome. So I appreciate all your interesting, thoughtful questions.